Welcome to Ancient Blueprint.
In medieval Europe, a handshake could transfer ownership of land. A kiss could seal loyalty. A bow could mean the difference between honor and exile. Welcome to a world where bodies spoke as clearly as words, where every gesture carried meaning, and every ritual shaped society itself. Rank, trust, piety, loyalty, shame, forgiveness. In medieval Europe, these were made visible through recurring gestures and behavioral routines. In a world where literacy was uneven and authority was enacted publicly, the body itself functioned as a social text. Bowing and kneeling, kissing hands or relics, exchanging tokens, each carried meanings that were widely understood. Medieval society depended on shared performance. A vassal placed joined hands within a lord's to do homage. The lord lifted and kissed him to accept it. That sequence, touch, posture, kiss, was not mere ornament. It made the relationship. Gesture was a grammar of power and belonging. A buyer received a clod of earth or a twig in livery of season to mark transfer of land. The token and the handing over ritual gave legal force to what might otherwise be only words. In the medieval world, faith was not merely an internal belief. It was a physical performance, a theology written on the body. Within the sacred space of the church, a complex grammar of gesture transformed a diverse populace into a single, unified body of Christ. The sign of the cross, traced deliberately from forehead to chest, was more than a habit. It was a personal shield against demonic influence, a miniature creed declared without a single word. Genuflection, the bending of the knee before the altar, was a profound act of humility, a physical acknowledgement of the real presence of God in the Eucharist. These were not empty motions. They were structured, rhythmic actions that gave the Mass its power, creating a visible, breathing community united in a shared choreography of devotion. Processions snaked through the aisles and out into the town, marking sacred time and claiming the landscape for the faithful. And the kiss of peace, often a formal, non-contact gesture passed down from the altar, was a tangible link in a chain of fellowship, a physical expression of the command to love one's neighbor. For a largely illiterate congregation, this bodily catechism was paramount. It taught the core tenets of the faith through muscle memory, ensuring that every member, from the lowest peasant to the highest lord, understood their place in the cosmic drama of salvation. This logic of public performance extended far beyond the church walls, policing the boundaries of social order. In a world built on honor and shame, communal judgment was swift, visible, and deeply embodied. A serious transgression against religious or social norms might result in public penance. The sinner, stripped of their status and dressed in sackcloth, would be made a spectacle at the church door, forced to beg for readmission into the community. Their physical abasement was a lesson for all who saw it. For more secular offenses, the community had its own rituals. The noisy, menacing charivari, or rough music, was a form of popular justice. If an old widower married a young bride, or a man was known to beat his wife, they might be woken by a cacophony of banging pots, jeering, and obscene songs. A theatrical, intimidating gesture of collective disapproval that enforced the unwritten laws of village life. In this environment, spoken language, though intensely important, was rarely trusted on its own. Words were fleeting, easily denied or misremembered. To have force, to be true and binding, words needed to be anchored in the physical world. They were almost always nested inside formal, observable acts. A priest's blessing was not just the words he spoke, but the raising of his hand in a specific motion. A marriage was not just the verbal consent, but the public joining of hands before witnesses. The action gave the words their legal and spiritual weight. Nowhere was this fusion of word and action more critical than in oath-taking. An oath was the bedrock of the legal and social order, and it required the most powerful anchors available. To swear an oath, a person would be brought before the community and made to perform a specific set of actions. They would invoke God's name while physically touching a sacred object. This fused speech with the sense of touch, making the promise tangible. Swearing on a saint's relic, a fragment of bone or cloth housed in an ornate reliquary, was particularly potent. It was believed that the saint's power resided in the object, and to lie while touching it was to invite immediate supernatural retribution from the saint themselves. The relic, the altar, and the solemn posture of the swearer all worked together to guarantee the truth value of the promise in a way that mere words never could. This principle, that performance validates truth, was the foundation of law and governance. When a lord granted land to a vassal, the transaction was often finalized not with a signature, but with the symbolic handover of a piece of turf, a twig, or a knife in the presence of witnesses. This physical performance, enacted on the land itself, created a powerful and shared public memory of the event, one that was considered more reliable than a document that could be forged or lost. Where words needed bodies, performance created a truth that was seen, shared, and remembered by the community. Royal authority itself was the ultimate performance, a masterpiece of political choreography. A king was not a king simply by blood, but by the successful execution of sacred rituals. The coronation was the supreme example. The ruler's procession through the streets presented him to his people. The sacred anointing with holy oil, the chrism, set him apart from ordinary mortals, likening him to the kings of the Old Testament. The investiture with regalia, the orb symbolizing his worldly domain under God, the scepter his justice, and the crown his sovereignty, were all physical acts that made his power manifest. This performance continued throughout his reign. The ritual of the royal touch was a powerful piece of public relations, where the king would touch subjects suffering from scrofula, a skin disease known as the king's evil. The belief that a legitimate, divinely sanctioned king could heal by touch was a recurring public demonstration of his sacred status. In these carefully staged ceremonies, the king performed his kingship before an audience that judged his legitimacy by sight as much as by sound. Even the rise of the written word did not escape this logic of physical gesture. A charter or legal document was not merely a text, its creation and use were performative. The act of affixing a seal was a physical extension of the owner's authority, a tangible imprint of their very identity pressed into wax. Witness lists were not just names, they were a record of the individuals who had physically stood and observed the transaction. And handover rituals, where the folded document was formally passed from one person to another, completed the performance. Some documents, called chirographs, were written in duplicate on one sheet of parchment and then cut apart with a unique, jagged line so that their authenticity could only be proven by physically reuniting the two halves, a final testament to the enduring power of the tangible object over the abstract word. This constant performance of status saturated daily life, especially in the routines of elite households. Table manners in a great hall were a microcosm of the entire social order, a daily lesson in hierarchy. The very architecture of the room, with the lord's family seated on a raised dais at the high table, made status visible. Who sat closest to the lord, who was served first, and who ate from silver versus pewter or wood, all of it encoded rank. Rituals of hand-washing, the precise knowledge of how to carve different meats, and rules of bodily comportment were not just about hygiene or politeness. They were markers of courtoisie, or courtliness, demonstrating the restraint and refinement that separated the noble from the commoner. Every interaction was a rehearsal of deference and power. The way one greeted a superior, the doffing of a cap, the depth of a bow, whether one knelt on one knee or two, was a carefully calibrated signal of relative status. Gift exchange was a complex language of obligation and alliance. To accept a gift from a lord was to accept his patronage. In this world, the body was the primary canvas of social identity. Every gesture, posture, and ritual was a broadcast, constantly communicating who you were, where you belonged, and what you believed. Nowhere was the medieval body more thoroughly disciplined than within the stone walls of a monastery. Here, life was not left to chance or individual whim. It was an orchestrated performance of devotion, governed by explicit rules. The foundational text for Western monasticism, the 6th century Rule of Saint Benedict, was a comprehensive blueprint for living. It meticulously ordered every facet of a monk's existence: the precise hours for sleep and waking, the sequence of prayers in the divine office that structured the day and night, the allocation of time for manual labor and sacred reading, the quantity and type of food to be eaten, and even the manner of walking and carrying oneself. This wasn't merely about creating an efficient institution. For the medieval monk, this rigorous physical discipline was a spiritual technology. By subduing the desires and impulses of the flesh, by synchronizing his every action with his brothers in a communal rhythm, he aimed to quiet the noise of the world and attune his soul to the voice of God. The monastery was to be a reflection of heavenly order on earth, and that order began with the control and sanctification of the individual body. Every bow, every step, every moment of silence was a prayer in itself, a conscious act of submission to a divine and communal will. A key part of this discipline was the cultivation of silence. The rule of Saint Benedict strongly discouraged idle talk, seeing it as a gateway to sin. To preserve this sacred quiet, especially in communal areas like the cloister, refectory, and dormitory, many communities developed highly sophisticated sign languages. These were not just a few rudimentary gestures. The influential Abbey of Cluny in France, for example, developed a system with hundreds of distinct signs, allowing for complex communication without a single word being uttered. A monk could ask for a specific book from the library, inquire about a tool needed for his work in the garden, or request more bread at dinner, all through a precise choreography of the hands. These monastic sign languages were a testament to the medieval ability to create intricate systems of meaning that were entirely nonverbal, transforming the very hands that performed manual labor into instruments of sophisticated dialogue. And crucially, they wrote these systems down. Monks compiled detailed catalogues of their signs known as signories. These were effectively dictionaries of gesture, listing the signs for everything from liturgical items like the Gospel book and censer, to everyday necessities like bread, wine, cheese, and eggs, to the tools of their labor like a knife or a hoe. The existence of these signaries is profound. It demonstrates that medieval people didn't just use gestures. They thought about them, analyzed them, and consciously codified them. This impulse to categorize and standardize nonverbal communication reveals a deep-seated belief in the power and importance of the body as a vessel of meaning. It was a formal language, one that had to be learned by novices and preserved for future generations, ensuring the continuity of the community's silent life. Did medieval people write these kinds of rules down beyond the monastery walls? The answer is a resounding yes. The monastic impulse to document and regulate behavior was mirrored throughout secular society. In an age that craved order, people created extensive written guides, in a variety of genres for vastly different audiences, on how to act, move, and behave in almost every conceivable social situation. Within monasteries themselves, the general rule of Saint Benedict was supplemented by customaries. These incredibly detailed texts laid out the specific traditions and rituals of a particular abbey. They were manuals of comportment, specifying everything: the precise depth of the bow required when passing the high altar, the correct order for processing into the choir for services, the proper way to hold one's spoon and knife in the refectory, how to receive a guest, and even the correct way to fold one's robes. Nothing was too small to be prescribed. This practice extended to the highest levels of secular power. Royal courts produced ordines, or coronation books, which prescribed the exact sequence of rites for making a king. Every action, the anointing with holy oil, the girding with the sword, the placement of the crown, the presentation of the scepter, was a symbolic gesture laden with political and theological meaning, performed in a strict, unchangeable order. In the growing towns and cities, civic authorities recorded the routes and order of grand public pageants, like the Feast of Corpus Christi. These records ensured that the complex procession of guilds, clergy, and officials could be perfectly replicated each year, reinforcing social hierarchy and the sacred geography of the city. Then, beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries, a new genre of text emerged, aimed at a broader, upwardly mobile audience: the courtesy book. As society became more complex, with the rise of courts and cities, individuals increasingly found themselves interacting with strangers of different social ranks. Courtesy books were practical guides to navigating this new social landscape, teaching the proper comportment, that would mark one as refined, educated, and worthy of belonging to the elite. Works like Daniel of Beccles were filled with specific practical advice. They taught how to greet one's social superiors versus one's equals, the precise moment to remove one's cap, and the importance of custody of the eyes, avoiding a bold stare which was considered aggressive, in favor of a modest, respectful gaze. They were especially detailed about table manners. Don't slurp your soup. Don't talk with your mouth full. Don't put your elbows on the table. When taking food from a shared dish, use only 3 fingers, and don't dip your bread in the communal salt cellar. These rules were about more than just hygiene. They were a performance of self-control and consideration, a visible sign of one's inner civility. The martial world of the aristocracy had its own codes, recorded in treatises on knighthood and chivalry. These specified the critical gestures of honor and combat. Raising one's visor was not just a way to see better, it was a gesture of trust, making oneself vulnerable to show peaceful intent. Surrendering a sword hilt first was a powerful act of submission, placing the victor in complete control. The entire structure of feudalism was built on such gestures, like the act of homage, where a vassal knelt and placed his clasped hands into his lord's, physically symbolizing his fidelity. So, with all this emphasis on the body, was gesture more important than words? The medieval mind would not have seen a conflict. Communication was understood as an integrative, multisensory experience. Speech, sight, physical space, and touch were not separate channels but interwoven strands of a single rope of meaning. Think of the Mass. The priest spoke in Latin, the sight of the elevated host, the smell of incense, the sound of the bells, and the kneeling of the congregation all worked together to create a single, overwhelming moment of theological significance. But in high-stakes legal and political contexts, the correct accompanying act was often considered more binding than the words alone. A written charter granting land was merely a record of the event. The legally crucial moment was the livery of seisin, the physical delivery of the property, where the grantor would publicly hand the grantee a clump of turf, a twig, or a key from the land itself. This tangible act, performed before witnesses, was the transfer. Similarly, an oath was not just a spoken promise. It was sworn with a hand on a Bible, or even more powerfully, on the relics of a saint. This act brought God and the saint into the contract as supernatural witnesses and enforcers. A land grant without livery, an oath sworn without touching relics. Each was weaker, and in many cases legally invalid. In a world of limited literacy, where authority was personal and had to be seen to be believed, meaning was performance. It was not an abstract concept to be found in a book, but a tangible reality enacted in the cathedral, the Great Hall, and the town square. Because authority was embodied and public, people expected and trusted meaning that arrived as a recognizable, physical, and shared experience. From the monk's silent gesture to the king's coronation, the body was the primary text, and its movements were the universal language that everyone was expected to read. To truly understand the medieval world, we must look beyond the written word and learn to read the language of the body. Their profound emphasis on gesture, ritual, and public performance wasn't a primitive quirk. It was a sophisticated social technology. 3 powerful factors explain why the body was the primary text of their society. First, and most fundamentally, audience and memory. In a world where parchment was a luxury and literacy was the domain of a select few, information had to be made memorable and accessible to all. Knowledge couldn't be stored on a shelf. It had to be inscribed in the collective mind of the community. Repeated public performances were the most effective way to teach and reinforce social norms, legal precedents, and religious doctrine. Think of the weekly Mass. For the peasant who could not read the Vulgate, the ceremony itself was the scripture. The priest's gestures, the rising and kneeling of the congregation, the tolling of the bell at the moment of consecration. This was a physical catechism, a choreographed lesson in theology that was learned through muscle memory and sensory experience, teaching complex ideas far more effectively than a text ever could. The second factor was verification. In an age before digital records and verifiable signatures, how could you prove a promise or a contract was real? How could you anchor truth? The answer was through tangible physical acts. Gestures anchored truth claims in a shared material world, transforming abstract agreements into concrete events. The most famous example is the act of homage, the cornerstone of the feudal system. When a vassal knelt before his lord, placed his hands between his lord's, and swore an oath of fealty, this was not mere symbolism. It was a legally binding contract, performed before witnesses, creating a bond more powerful than any written document. Similarly, when land was transferred, the seller might hand the buyer a clod of earth, a twig, or a ceremonial knife known as a. This object wasn't a souvenir, it was the physical embodiment of the transaction, a piece of the reality that had just been created. Oaths were sworn on holy relics, linking the speaker's words to the sacred power of the saint and the threat of divine retribution. The body, interacting with these potent objects and performing these scripted actions, was the ultimate authenticator of truth. The third factor was the cultivation of inner disposition, affection, and discipline. Medieval thinkers believed that the soul and the body were inextricably linked. To shape one was to shape the other. Therefore, emotions and virtues were not seen as spontaneous feelings, but as habits to be cultivated through rigorous, repeated bodily practice. The monastery was the ultimate laboratory for this technology of the self. The Rule of Saint Benedict, for instance, is a detailed manual for spiritual formation through physical discipline. The prescribed prostrations, the specific tones for chanting psalms, the enforced silence, these were all designed to remold the inner man, to train the soul. Bowing wasn't just a sign of humility, it was an exercise that humility. Fasting didn't just signal restraint, it actively the will against temptation. This principle extended to the secular world as well. The elaborate etiquette of the royal court was a form of discipline for the warrior elite. Learning the precise way to carve meat, to hold a cup, or to bow to a lady trained a knight in the virtue of, or courtesy, tempering his martial aggression with grace and self-control. While our world seems centuries removed, these medieval principles reveal timeless truths about how human societies function. They understood that actions authenticate words. A lord's promise was just breath in the air until it was sealed with his ring or accompanied by the ceremonial granting of a charter. The physical act was the guarantee, the tangible proof that etched the promise into the memory of all who saw it. This wasn't just a workaround for illiteracy, it was a profound understanding that trust is built on deeds, not just declarations. A person's worth was measured by the alignment of their spoken word and their performed action. They also knew that rituals make values sticky. For a value to become part of a culture, it must be performed. Consider the initiation of a stonemason into his guild. He didn't just fill out an application, he underwent a solemn ceremony, swearing oaths on the Bible and the guild's charter, being presented with symbolic tools, and sharing a ritual meal with his new brothers. This multi-sensory, emotionally charged experience physically and psychologically bound him to the guild's core values: quality craftsmanship, mutual support, and trade secrecy. Repeated, simple, physical sequences can transmit a culture far more effectively than a written mission statement. If a value truly matters to a group, it must be ritualized. Furthermore, public witnessing builds accountability. In a society where the community's memory was the primary archive, major life events were performed publicly. A marriage contract, for example, was often finalized not in private but at the church door, in the face of the church and by extension, the entire community. This public performance turned every villager into a witness and a guardian of the new social reality. This collective memory was a powerful deterrent to future disputes. If the legitimacy of the marriage or an inheritance was ever questioned, the community could testify. We were there. We saw the joining of hands. We heard the vows. This web of witnesses created a powerful, decentralized system of social accountability. The medieval body was also an instruction manual. Skills were passed down not through textbooks, but through embodied demonstration. A master blacksmith taught his apprentice the craft by letting him feel the rhythm of the hammer, see the color of the hot iron, and learn the precise posture needed to strike effectively. In the training yard, a knight didn't learn swordsmanship from a scroll. He learned it by mirroring the movements of his master, his own body slowly absorbing the lessons of stance, timing, and balance. Knowledge was choreographed and transmitted from one body to another. This direct physical pedagogy recognized that true mastery lives in the muscles and nerves, not just in the intellect. Choreography always beats paragraphs. In this world, tokens and spaces carried immense meaning. A physical object or a designed environment could turn an abstract value into a felt reality. The bone of a saint housed in a golden reliquary was not just a symbol, it was a point of direct contact with the holy. For a pilgrim who had journeyed for months, touching that reliquary was the physical culmination of their faith, a tangible connection to the divine. Likewise, the very architecture of a cathedral was a tool for instruction and transformation. Its soaring vaults were designed to pull the gaze and the spirit heavenward, while its stained glass windows served as luminous storybooks for the faithful, turning the building itself into a sermon in stone and light. And while we think of them as pre-literate, they were pioneers in the codification of these scripts. As the Middle Ages progressed, there was a growing movement to write down these social choreographies. Monasteries created customals, detailed playbooks that scripted everything from the order of processions to the gestures of prayer. Books of hours became popular among the wealthy laity, providing a script for their daily devotions. Chivalric manuals, penned by authors like Christine de Pizan, laid out the precise codes of conduct for knights. These were not just books to be read, They were scripts to be performed, ensuring that new members of a community could learn the culture and perform it correctly from day one. By the late medieval period, the advent of the printing press accelerated this trend of written codification. Yet, the fundamental insight persisted. A stable social order rests on the foundation of publicly legible bodies. The book did not replace the body. It simply provided a more standardized script for it to perform. This legacy flowed directly into the eras that followed. The courts of the Renaissance didn't abandon gesture. They refined it into an art form, cultivating the elegant ideal of, or studied nonchalance. The Protestant Reformation was, in many ways, a battle over ritual, a deliberate re-scripting of the gestures of worship to reflect a new theology. And modern states, for all their bureaucracy, still rely on the power of medieval-style ceremony. The inauguration of a president, the pageantry of a coronation, the solemnity of a courtroom, all are performances designed to make power visible and legitimate. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where bodies spoke constantly, and everyone knew the language. For them, a gesture was not a mere decoration for words. It was a deed. It was the tool used to authenticate a promise, discipline the soul, and transmit knowledge across generations. It was the very substance of social life. We might be tempted to dismiss this intense focus on ritual and gesture as quaint or superstitious, but to do so is to miss the genius of their solution to the timeless human problems of building trust, creating shared memory, and forging cohesive groups. In a world of uncertainty, they built a society on the most reliable medium they had. Their bodies were their social text, and its pages are filled with a wisdom we would do well to study today.
Thank you for watching Ancient Blueprints. Help us to grow our channel and bring ancient knowledge into the modern world. To help us grow, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. Feel free to comment below and let us know. What are you most curious about?